We're going to be talking about some child development theories that guide our understanding of children and our understanding of how children develop within the context of their family and community and their world. Um, so these next slides are review of some of the more dominant child development theories. And these theories are accepted as valid and reliable explanations of child development and behavior. Of course, there are instances of non-normative development, and we'll get into that later in the course. This is an overview. Maturationist theory, a prominent theorist in maturationist theory is Gazelle, and he posits that children learn and behave as they do because they have inborn predispositions to do so. The idea that people are genetically predetermined. For example, some children are very talented in the arts because of genetically derived or inherited traits. From this view, all children, regardless of their background or culture, develop behaviors and skills in a similar time frame. All children learn to walk, talk, and read in the first few years after birth due to inherited biological determination at birth. There is some refuting evidence when we look across cultures. For example, in the reading on Our Babies Ourselves, there is some difference in when children learn to walk and talk depending on the needs of the cultural group. So that's something to consider when you're doing that reading, week 3. Temperament is a good example of maturationist theory. Temperament, which was developed in the 1950s, is the work of Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess, included particular traits of temperament. And the trait of temperament of activity asks the question, is the child always moving and doing something, or does she or he have a more relaxed style? The trait of rhythmosity is the child regular in his or her eating and sleeping habits or somewhat haphazard? So that do they have a rhythm established for eating and sleeping and sort of basic functioning? Approach withdrawal trait. Does he or she never meet a stranger, meaning friendly with everyone? Or do they tend to shy away from new people or things? Adaptability, the trait addresses, can the child adjust to changes in routines or plans easily, or does he or she resist transitions? The trait of intensity, does he or she react strongly to situations, either positive or negative? Or does he or she react calmly and quietly? That would be the trait of intensity. The trait of mood, does the child often express a negative outlook, or is he or she generally a positive person? And does the mood shift frequently, or is it the child even-tempered? Persistence and attention span trait, does the child give up as soon as a problem arises with a task, or does he or she keep on trying? Can she or he stick with an activity for a long time, or does his or her mind tend to wander? The trait of distractibility, is the child easily distracted from what he or she is doing, or can he or she shut out external distractions and stay with the current activity? And then sensory threshold trait, is he or she bothered by external stimuli such as loud noises, bright lights, or food textures, or do they tend to ignore them? And these traits together can begin to tell us a little bit about a temperament of a child. The temperament styles work according to Thomas and Chess. Those traits we just identified combine to form 3 basic types of temperaments, and approximately 65% of all children fit into one of these 3 patterns. 40% of children are generally regarded as easy or flexible, 10% are regarded as difficult, active, or feisty, and the final 15% are regarded as slow to warm up or cautious. And the other 35% of children are a combination of these patterns. By understanding these patterns, parents can tailor their parenting approach in such areas as expectations, encouragement, and discipline that suit the child's unique needs. So, when we talk about easier, flexible children, usually we're talking about kids who people would describe as calm, happy, regular in sleeping and eating habits, adaptable, and not easily upset. And because these kids are easy, parents really need to have special times to talk with a child about their frustration and hurts because this child may not demand it or ask for it, and they may unintentionally get ignored or overlooked because they're not really seeking out that kind of attention or demanding that attention. And this kind of intentional communication is necessary for caregivers to find out what the child's thinking and feeling. Children who are described as uh, a temperament style of active, difficult, or feisty are often fussy kids. They're irregular in their feeding and sleeping habits. They might be fearful of new people and situations. They might be easily upset by noise and commotion. They might be described as high strung or intense in their reactions. And it's important for children to have the opportunity, children who are described as difficult, active, or feisty, to have opportunities for vigorous play, to work off this energy and frustration with some freedoms of choice that allow these children to feel successful, and preparing these children for transitions by redirection, warning when moving from activity to activity is really helpful. Often, kids who are difficult are kids who are extremely intelligent, or kids who end up being pretty competitive kids and do very well competitively. Children with the temperament style of slow to warm up or cautious are children who are relatively inactive and fussy. They tend to withdraw or react negatively to new situations, but their reactions gradually become more positive the more they're in the environment. And sticking to a routine and your word, along with allowing ample time to establish relationships, are necessary to allow these kids to become independent. A slow to warm up kid is the kid who you go to the park and you put them down in the sandbox and they just watch for a while. You know, they might have their finger in their mouth while they stare at other kids or watch what's going on. And after a little while, they might begin to approach and might begin to work with another child or bring their toys into the situation. So they're kids who don't jump right in, and they're kids who might not refuse to participate. It just takes them a little while to relax and feel comfortable. They're kind of checking everything out. Most kids have some level of intensity on several temperament traits, but usually one dimension will dominate. So, given a situation, one particular child might have each of these styles, but usually we can say a child has more of one of these areas. And we really don't want to be negative about these traits, and we really want to avoid kids being labeled as being a crybaby or lazy or difficult or any of those things, uh, obviously. And the child's abilities to develop and behave in acceptable ways are determined by us, by adults in their lives who try to identify, recognize, and respond to a child's unique temperament. We can't expect every child to behave the same way. And it might be that your temperament is the same as one child's temperament, and so it might make it easier for you to understand that child. But in contradiction to that, it might be because you share a temperament with a child, you might get more impatient with them because you know the potential that they might have. So we can adjust our the way that we work with children and the way that we parent children in order to really be positive in responding to the world. And so when we accommodate or we match the child's temperament with our expectations, we call that a goodness of fit. And temperament is biological, as mentioned previously. It's part of the maturationist theory that it is biological and it is not something that goes away. We can socialize over time and we can change our behaviors over time, but the basic temperament is not changed. We just socialize or accommodate in order to act a certain way in the world. But temperament itself is biological. So moving on from maturationist theory to behaviorist theory, this includes prominent behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, Watson, and Albert Bandura. And behaviorists contend that most of what children are and what they will become is due to the environment. The Watson, famous for many different experiential theories, and you'll see on the next few pages that there are some links to YouTube videos to see Watson pigeon experiment and the B.F. Skinner monkey experiment. B.F. Skinner's monkey experiment was fairly famous. He put two metal monkeys in a cage. One of the metal monkeys had kind of soft material on it, and the monkeys gravitated to the softer material monkey shape in the research over and over and over again. So it sort of proved that over time uh, we can both monitor, watch behavior, and evaluate behavior, and we can change behavior based on behaviorist theory. So classical and operant conditioning are two forms of behaviorism, and you'll watch a video about that shortly. In classical conditioning, adults shape children's behavior by pairing a neutral event with something either pleasurable or not pleasurable, and over time children begin to respond to the neutral event the same as they respond to the pleasurable experience. So imagine what that might mean. For example, in classrooms, elementary school classrooms, we often see a board in the room that has every child's name, and then it might have a yellow card, a green card, and a red card. And the cards change are changed by the teacher when a child does something positive or does something negative, so that a child can look over at the board and see, gee, earlier today I was green, everything was good, I was doing all right, now I'm yellow. And so the card itself has no meaning until the child experiences that they either get a reward or a punishment based on what kind of card they have showing next to their name. So here are a couple of or one video actually in two different locations. It might work better for you in one or the other. This is a video on classical and operant conditioning. And the B.F. Skinner pigeon experiment link is here. And the Albert Bandura Bobo doll experiment on modeled aggression. The video link is here. And psychoanalytic theory, moving on theoretically to our next theory, psychoanalytic theory focuses exclusively on the formation of personality. So psychoanalysts posit that children's emotional health is a result of ability to resolve conflict between their internal drives and the external world. And a healthy child is one who walks a fine line between immediate need gratification and the control of urges. The prominent theorist for psychoanalytic theory is Sigmund Freud. Freud postulated that basic urges are located in the id, a significant part of the mind, and the id creates a constant pressure to satisfy basic urges. The superego emerges in early infancy to keep the id in check, and the ego is more rational and regulates the instinctual impulses of the id to be more appropriate. Erik Erikson is a developmental theorist. He is credited with developmental theory, And it's the belief that children develop over time, and there are certain stages of development that we would expect. And for example, he starts with trust versus mistrust as a stage of development. It's actually considered a crisis of development that occurs between birth to 18 months. And then there's the stage or crisis of development of autonomy versus shame and doubt from 18 months to 3.5 years old. There's initiative versus guilt stage or crisis, and that occurs between age 3.5 or 3.5 years old to 6 years old. Industry versus inferiority, age 6 to 12 years old. Identity versus role confusion, which occurs in adolescence. Intimacy versus isolation, which occurs as young adult. And generativity versus stagnation as a mature adult. And integrity versus despair as an older adult. So these are the same stages and virtues, and you can see that in infancy there is trust versus mistrust, that the relational focus, the focus of relationship is mother and caregivers, mother and other caregivers, and the central question facing the child is, how can I be secure? The virtue they would emerge from in this stage is hope, trust, and optimism. In early childhood, age 2 to 3 years old, autonomy versus shame and doubt. The relational focus is usually the parents or caregivers. The central question, how can I be independent? And the virtue they emerge with is will, use and exercise of freedom and self-restraint. So you think about terrible twos. That's really all about how can I be independent, right? The me, mine, all of that has to do with independence. The stage of childhood or play between age 4 to 6 is the stage of initiative versus guilt, and that the relational focus is family, caregivers, and beginning to be school. And the central question that the child is facing is, how can I be powerful? And the associated virtue is purpose and direction, the ability to initiate one's own activities and pursue goals. And these are ages in which children are beginning to choose their clothes and take care of basic household chores, little things that they do to contribute. And that has to do with their sense of initiative and agency. In childhood, school-age children, 7 to 12, the psychosocial issue they're facing is industry versus inferiority, and this relational focus is family and neighborhood and school. And the central question is, how can I be good? And the associated virtue is competence in intellectual, social, and physical skills. In adolescence, age 13 to 19, psychosocial issue is identity versus role confusion, and the relational focus is often peer groups. Again, family is involved, school is involved, neighborhoods involved, but for the first time, peer groups really start to emerge as being a focus. And the central question for the child is, how can I fit into the adult world and who am I? And the associated virtue is fidelity and an integrated image of oneself as a unique person. Young adulthood, 19 to 35, the psychosocial issue is intimacy versus isolation. The relational focus is partners in friendship and the other. And the central question is, how can I love? So the idea of love, mutuality, finding and losing oneself in the other, and caregiver commitments. Adulthood, age 35 to 55, the psychosocial issue is generativity versus stagnation. The relational focus is divided labor and shared household. The central question is, how can I fashion a gift? So the associated virtue for adulthood is care, solicitude, guidance, and teaching a new generation. Maturity, age 55 and older. The psychosocial issue is ego integrity versus despair. The relational focus is humankind. And the central question is, how can I receive a gift? And the associated virtue is wisdom, a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction with one's own life. Cognitive development theory holds that the mental growth is the most important element in child development, and the most influential cognitive developmentalist was Jean Piaget. Um, and Piaget believed that knowledge is constructed through the action of the learner. From birth, humans are designed to interact with the environment and to be active participants in it. Until Piaget, people really thought that children just developed. The maturationist theory and philosophies previously, the idea of a tabula rasa or a blank slate, the idea that children could be influenced and we could punish children or reward children and then they would become a certain kind of person. But Piaget, for the first time, identified that children are active participants in their own development. And that significantly changed the way that we understand child development. Probably one of the single most influential beliefs, the idea that children are active participants in their own development. So Piaget and his developmental theory includes four stages. So there's the sensory motor phase, which is the where the infant explores the world through direct sensory and motor contact. In this sensory motor stage, there is object permanence and separation anxiety that develop. Preoperational stage, 2 to 6 years old, the child uses symbols like words and images to represent objects but does not reason logically. The child also has the ability to pretend, and during this stage the child is pretty egocentric between 2 and 6 years old. Concrete operational phase, 7 to 12 years old, the child can think logically about concrete objects and can add and subtract, and the child also understands the function of conservation, the skill of conservation. In formal operational phase, from 12 years to adult, then the child or adolescent can reason abstractly and begin to think in hypothetical terms. So here's a video linked to some examples of each of those tasks and skills. Renee Spitz was someone who studied children in orphanages at the turn of the century, and he studied children in orphanages who did not have parents or other significant emotional attachments to their caregivers. They had caretakers who were paid, who changed often, and those caretakers provided food and clothing and a roof, but they weren't a stable caretaker that provided attachment. And what he found in his work is that children who didn't have an attachment figure would withdraw, become depressed, they failed to thrive, and at high rates, they died from a lack of attached relationship with another. And then, based on Spitz's work, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth did a great deal of incredibly important research on attachment. Attachment being the relationship between either the mother or another primary caregiver and the infant, and that attachment is something that happens throughout the lifespan. John Bowlby found that the fear of strangers represents an important survival mechanism that is built in by nature. and that babies are born with the tendency to display certain innate characters, which he called social releasers, which help ensure proximity and contact with the mother or attachment figure, either by crying, smiling, crawling, and these are species-specific behaviors. So that babies, when they smile, crawl, and cry, they get the attention of the caregiver, and the caregiver gets close to them, maybe holds them, maybe touches them, and they certainly get proximity from that caregiver, and that influences what kind of attachment they have. And he came up with these types of attachment, which then Mary Ainsworth did a significant amount of research to further develop. So now we have secure attachment, which are securely attached children, comprise a majority of the sample in her work in 1971 and 78. And secure children feel confident that their attachment figure will be available to meet their needs. They use the attachment figure as a safe base to explore the environment and seek the attachment figure in times of distress. Securely attached infants are easily soothed by the attachment figure when they're upset. And infants develop a secure attachment when the caregiver is sensitive to their signals and they respond appropriately to their needs. According to Bowlby, an individual who's experienced a secure attachment is likely to possess a representational model of attachment figures as being available, responsive, and helpful. So it's not that there is a certain measure of attachment that will lead to a child having secure attachment. It's that secure attachment is a pretty basic level of just being available, responsive, and helpful. So insecure avoidant attachment, Mary Ainsworth found that insecure avoidant children do not orientate to their attachment figure while they're investigating the environment. They're very independent of the attachment figure, both physically and emotionally. They do not seek contact with the attachment figure when they're distressed. And such children are likely to have a caregiver who's insensitive and rejecting of their needs. And the attachment figure may withdraw from helping during difficult tasks and is often unavailable during times of emotional distress. So it might be that a child has multiple primary caretakers or is a child in a new environment, and they, for some reason, in very early years, they may have experienced caregivers who were insensitive and rejecting of their needs, and so they need to relearn the whole process of attachment. So we often, if we don't realize that attachment is a fixed way of engaging with caregivers, we might think that a child is acting this way because of something that the current caregiver is doing, when in fact it might be another caregiver from whom they've learned and now have these kinds of symptoms and behaviors. So we absolutely can do all kinds of things to change insecure avoidant attachment patterns and behaviors. Insecure ambivalent attachment is the third attachment style identified by Ainsworth, and it is insecure ambivalent, also called insecure resistant. Children adopt an ambivalent behavioral style toward the attachment figure. They may be clingy and dependent, but they will be rejecting of the attachment figure when they engage in interaction. So they fail to develop any feelings of security from the attachment figure. They may exhibit difficulty moving away from the attachment figure to explore their surroundings. And when they're distressed, they are difficult to soothe and not comforted by interaction with the attachment figure. And this behavior results from an inconsistent level of response to their needs from the primary caregiver. So it might be that you see different behavior on different days. A child may be clingy and dependent, but then when the attachment figure tries to do something, they reject them. And that over time, they don't learn to develop that sense of security from the attachment figure that allows them to move forward in their life, to feel secure. Many children develop all three of these kinds of exhibition of symptoms, but usually a child will settle in one or the other of these three attachment styles. And it's important because it assists us with providing interventions and recommendations for people to move to a more secure attachment. All of these, number 2 and number 3, we can do lots of different things to change this attachment pattern to be more secure. Here's a link to the strange situation experiment. And at this video, we see Mary Ainsworth, her more famous assessment of attachment using the strange situation experiment.